In this video, we are going to be going over the exploration section of the psychology IA. We will try understanding the requirements, common errors, tips, and also how to structure this section of your IA. The exploration section is pretty much the methodology that you may have written in previous reports in your science classes, or you may be preparing for your extended essay. The same way, in your exploration section, you're going over all aspects of your methodology for your IA experiment. This section, unlike the other three, is only worth 4 marks, but these 4 marks are quite easy to achieve if you meet all of the requirements. And there are 4 main things that you need to include in your exploration. First, the research design. Second, the sampling technique. Third, the choice of participants. Fourth, controlled variables, and finally, your choice of materials. And the most important part is not just identifying what your research design is or what your sampling technique is, but briefly describing how it was used in your IA, and more importantly, explaining why you chose that research design or why you chose that sampling technique. Most students miss out on marks for the same reason, which is they identify or they describe the research design or the controlled variables, but they do not explain why they chose to control that specific variable. So this is a very common error, and this usually results in students getting only 1 or 2 marks out of 4 because they have not explained their choices or explained why. And also there is another common error, which is confusing research design with research method. So instead of referring to independent measures design or repeated measures design, the student simply mentions that they conducted a lab experiment, right? So here, this is another very common error in the exploration section. In terms of tips, the exploration is only worth 4 out of 22 marks of your IA. So it is important to allocate an appropriate number of words to this section so then you can actually prioritize in-depth evaluation later on, right? So the number of words I would recommend to allocate to this section is about 350 to 400 words. I believe this is sufficient for you to be able to explain your choices in detail, but still have enough words to let's say, do your evaluation later on. Other than that, I think it's very important to write to the point and write as concisely as possible rather than being too lengthy in your descriptions. Another thing I would recommend is adding subheadings that correspond with the requirements of the rubric. For example, having subheadings like research design, then sampling method and choice of participants, control variables, materials, and then adding your points under each of those sections. And finally, in this section, you can actually write some of your points as bullet points. This could be done for the control variables and materials section especially, where you do not have to write long paragraphs to be able to describe that effectively. Moving on to the actual structure, I would recommend about 4 to 5 paragraphs for the exploration section. And again, some of these are going to be lists rather than paragraphs. And I will explain a little later on why 4 or 5. So paragraph 1 will be allocated to the research design. Over here, again, you have to identify the research design that your study uses and also explain your choice, right? So I would recommend to use about 50 words to do so, maximum of 75. So you will first identify what research design you have used, which is it an independent measures design? Is it a repeated measures design? Is it a matched pairs design? And you will then explain how it was used in your research. For example, participants were divided into 2 separate groups with an independent measures design, where one group listened to music, the other did not listen to any music, right? So simple idea over here. So the first, you will basically identify and describe, and then you will explain why. And the reasons you provide for your choice should be specific to your investigation or experiment. Yes, using an independent measures design helps us avoid order effects and practice effects or demand characteristics, but mention specifically in terms of your experiment how order effects may occur or how practice may occur or how there may be guessing of the true aim of the research. And identifying specific reasons helps you provide a stronger justification for your choices. And this will allow you to score the 3 and 4 that you hope to receive in this section. Moving on to the sampling technique and the participants, there are a few things that you need to consider when answering this, but before that, what I would recommend is allocating about 75 to 100 words to this paragraph. Here, you will start off by answering the question, what was the sampling method you utilized? Okay, who were your participants? How many were there? Describe their characteristics. Explain your choice of the participants. And what was your inclusion and exclusion criteria? So you can start off by actually talking about your sampling technique. So for example, you used a convenience sampling or a volunteer sampling, which are actually the most common sampling methods used in IA experiments. So you will first identify this sampling technique and explain how it was used, right? So a convenience sampling method was used where we conducted the research during an evening study where all the school students are present in the same location, and so on and so forth. So you're kind of describing how the convenience sampling was used. And then you will explain why the convenience sampling method was used, right? It is more cost effective, it is more efficient, it allows you to conduct research in a time where all participants are relatively free. So these could be possible reasons why you chose that sampling method. Then moving on, you will actually then go into the main characteristics of the participants. So how many were there? Who were they? Were they students, teachers, parents? Were they grade 8 students? Were they grade 10 students? Were they DP only students? You need to then provide simple demographic details. For example, you can explain the gender breakdown or whether they were first language learners or second language learners, any other details that would be relevant to your study, okay? And again, you need to explain why those participants were your target population and why were they part of your sample, right? For example, if you're doing Loftus and Palmer's research, it would be relevant to say, oh yeah, we chose teachers and parents to be a part of our research because they're the ones who have driving experience. They're the ones who actually have a driving license, as opposed to students who are in high school who probably have no driving experience. So the results of the estimation that adults give may be more relevant and valid than those provided by students. So that would be a rationale or a reason for you to choose adults over students. You will then move on to your controlled variables. Again, here I would recommend writing it as a list or as a table. And again, you can allocate about 75 to 100 words to it. First, I would recommend to identify all of the extraneous or confounding variables that you expect. And you should have done this at your proposal stage already, right? But you need to be able to identify the possible extraneous variables or confounding variables that may have impacted your research. And then list about 3 to 4 controlled variables and why you had chosen to control them in your research. For example, having a Sudoku distraction task for 30 seconds between reading a list of words versus actually recalling them can help prevent the recency effect and actually test the long-term memory rather than short-term memory, right? So this would be a control variable that you have put in place. Another example could be choosing the same passage to read in both groups so that there's consistency of difficulty, familiarity with the text, and so on and so forth, right? So again, you need to be able to explain the control variable with reference to extraneous factors that may have possibly impacted your results. You then move on to your materials section. Again, I would allocate about 75 to 100 words here, and you can present it as a list or a table. Most students make the mistake of mentioning very generic materials that were used in their studies, such as pen, paper, projector, and this is really not going to fetch you a lot of points, and it's not going to let the examiner know what materials were used or developed and why they were for your study specifically, right? So it is important for you to identify specific materials that you used for your study and explain your choice for why that was selected over other options. For example, if you have chosen a TEDx video on pharaohs, why was it that you chose that specific video for your group of participants? Another example could be if you had them fill out a questionnaire which had open-ended questions to test their comprehension of the video on pharaohs. Why was it that you had open-ended questions rather than MCQ-style questions? So these kind of explanations of your materials will also be very important for you to be able to achieve the 3 and 4 marks. Finally, you have the procedure, and again, this can also be allocated for about 75 to 100 words. This is where you will provide your step-by-step description of your procedure, including the ethical considerations. So participants signed informed consent, standardized instructions were read out, participants were then later on debriefed and provided information about their right to withdraw, so on and so forth. However, this procedure is not directly assessed in the rubric. So if you are really short for words when it comes to your entire report, the procedure can be one section that can be moved into your appendices, but make sure that you have a little indicator that says, please find procedure in the Appendix A, Appendix B, wherever you've included it, right? So this will help you cut some words from your exploration and then allocate it to, let's say, the evaluation section. I hope you found this video helpful and have a better idea of how to approach and write your exploration section. Generally speaking, I think the exploration section is one where you can achieve the 4 out of 4. All you need to do is first accurately identify the different aspects of your methodology. Second, describe how that was used in your study. And finally, provide specific and well-justified reasons for your choices of methodology.